Hi. I was going to say it's really good to see your smiling faces, but I quickly am realizing that I can't see whether or not you're smiling at all. So it's good to see your smizing faces. I'm so honored to be up here. I really see this run of lectures as an opportunity for a conversation. It's such an honor to join a conversation that Vanessa started yesterday with her incredible talk. I don't know who was there for that, but gosh, it was great. And thank you so much to SWC, the staff, the faculty, Leah, Adam, et al. For putting me in this conversation. And so what I'm going to do today is kind of my take on things, but I'd always like to build and evolve and learn more about the use of research as a creative act, especially since we have poets, playwrights, fiction writers, journalists, and lots of other different kinds of art makers represented here. So, let's keep this conversation going and talk, if you want to keep talking shop, at the French House or at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. You can bang on my hotel room door. Please don't do that. I don't know why I said that out loud. But I'm excited to get started over the next 45 minutes and then keep talking for the next several days. I'm here to discuss how writers like myself and you can use research to enhance the unique creative potential in your work on levels from the global big view, from the process-oriented view, all the way down to the syllabic. And I'm going to mostly speak of it in terms of my bag, which is the literary essay. It's kind of what I read, write, teach, eat, sleep, crap out, But we often talk about the openness required for the creative essay, and also other forms of contemporary nonfiction that resemble it. And if we assume, as I sometimes do when I'm speaking really quickly in like a craft lecture or in a class, that all high-functioning literary essays from Montaigne to Marzano-Lesnevich, from Seneca to Sabatini-Sloan, if they all combine four elements together, the elements of form, scene, commentary, and research, we are often encouraged as writers to not make up our minds about what an essay might do for three of those things, formally, scenically, and intellectually, until we've mucked through it a bit, because so much opportunity, for example, for formal discovery and scene work and honing of the commentary that powers an essay lies in the actual making of the piece. But I get the impression, however, that we don't put the same process-based expectations on research and how it can contribute to the making of an essay. Often, only after the creative groundwork is laid do we then stack like a finite set of books on our desk to thumb through when we need the answers. Or we do all the research at the very beginning of a project and then we push it aside and we sit down to write. And the research craft discussion, as I have often experienced it in textbooks, conferences, and classrooms, is less focused on openness than on answers, which is fine, but it makes research become merely our opportunity to report something or to recount it, which are static responsibilities referencing fixed material, rather than to do what a lot of people try to do with a craft approach to form or scene or commentary, which is creating new material through those elements ourselves as writers. And I have a sneaking suspicion that this might create a kind of aversion or suspicion or even like a fear of research. And the reason that I have that suspicion is because people come up to me and say, oh my God, you use so much research in your work, I could never do that. How do you do that? What's your process? Did you go to school? Are you a librarian? So that's where the suspicion has come from. But y'all, for me, research is the tool that I use to get my imagination going. And also, and this is very important, it's the tool that I use to keep it running. I find research to be my ultimate creative act. And so the first half of this talk, or the first really 2/3 of this talk, will be a sort of evangelical personal testimony supporting that belief and to bring you all over to my side, Team Research Forever. I'm going to start globally by outlining the wild mindset and process that allows a creative engagement with research. And to do that, to get started out, I'm going to just give you this like ridiculous anecdote in the form of a metaphor. So a few summers ago, my partner and I took a vacation to Yellowstone National Park, which is very unlike us. But we had recently moved to Oregon, and I heard a rumor that you got kicked out of the state if you didn't do at least one outdoorsy thing each year. So we drove to Yellowstone, and we're driving around, and we're stopping at all the stops on the Yellowstone app that I had downloaded from my phone and that it said I was supposed to stop at. And we parked at some trailhead, and there was a sign at the front of the trail that read, Point Sublime, 1.0 miles. And I was like, oh, that sounds like something we should see. Point Sublime, right? And a mile didn't seem like we'd be venturing too far into the scary wilderness to get into too much trouble. So we got out of the car, and it was a kind of a hilly trail, and it ran right alongside this huge canyon. I think it's like the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone Park. Those of you who actually do go outside have probably experienced it. And the path was pretty windy. And like I said, we're not outdoorsy people, so we kind of immediately lost our sense of what 1.0 miles feels like, thanks to that unfamiliar terrain. Like on the treadmill, a mile is like 12 minutes, so I was like, okay, just as long as 12 minutes have gone by, that's probably a mile. That's probably when we will have reached Point Sublime. And then like 6 minutes into it, there was this kind of like clearing, and there was this like vista, and you could see the Grand Canyon, and like sort of like a Bob Seger song started playing in my head, and there was like a hawk going about like, ah, and it just really felt like pretty like, oh, maybe this is Point Sublime, but like I was remembering the treadmill, and I was like, oh, it hasn't been 12 minutes, there's no way that this could be it, so we kept on walking, and then we walked like a little bit longer, and there was another kind of cleared out space, and it was like a straight drop down. So we were like leaning over it and getting this like intense vertigo. And so I thought, well, maybe this is Point Sublime, like the negative sublime, like, you know, like confronting our own like death and dismemberment. But then I still wasn't sure. And so I was like, oh, well, let's keep walking. I don't even know how to get back to the car anyway. So then we kept on walking. I know those of you who hike like 77 miles this morning are probably like, Jesus, Lord, Elena. But we're not very good at this. So then we kept on walking again, and then we saw this tree, this like redwood-looking tree. It was so tall, and it was so loud when it creaked that it made this amazing noise, and we were staring up at it and having this like big moment, and then a squirrel ran down the tree, and then another squirrel started chasing that squirrel, and then they started fighting, or at least I thought they were fighting. They could have been doing something else, and then I wanted to give them some privacy, so then we kept on walking, and at this point I had no idea how long we had been walking, and I was kind of getting frustrated and mad, and I started thinking about whether or not I loved my partner enough not to eat him, and and then we came to this like big clearing, and there was like a railroad tie, and one of the X's of the railroad tie was down, and it said on the sign, Point Sublime. And I like looked, and it was great. It looked really, really good, but it was still kind of like, wah, wah, you know. But the thing is, it doesn't matter, because I learned something really useful on that trip, some really useful things about sublimity. I learned about my sense of time. I learned about my interest. I learned about what keeps me walking, what forces me to stop, and for how long. That hike taught me about my own attention. It also taught me about feeling vertigo and what squirrels look like when they make the sweet love. And this, my friends, is exactly what I think a creative research process requires. First, some kind of goal, an artifact, or a document-based wish list gets me out of my car and sends me walking, moving through sources unregimentedly toward a perceived unilateral answer. But by the time the walk is over and I've reached that original destination, the stops I've made along the way have proven much more fruitful and telling than the original task could ever be. The walk has a different theme now. Indeed, the creative researched material in my finalized essays, as well as the aboutness of the pieces, they usually have little and sometimes nothing to do with my originally listed goals. And even though I'm still very terrible at being outdoorsy, I've learned to embrace this process in the essays that I make. I trick myself that I'm getting out of the car to go to Point Sublime, but I bring along another hiker inside of me, one that I sometimes hear and sometimes pretend to tune out, who's always keeping an eye peeled or a notebook open for facty vistas along the way that pique my gut interest. So it's a kind of motivational creative core that involves something more about me as an artist than the surface level or stated research question at hand. And I'm going to say right now that researching this way, this kind of meandering, stopping at all these different places, pretending that you're going to do one thing, and then following whatever lead sends you the other way, it is so messy, and it is meandering. And you often feel very ill-outfitted, and you rarely know if you're on the right track. And when you stop and think about those modifiers that I just used, disheveled, messy, peripatetic, wandering off track, none of them connect to this assumed formal rigor of what many of us have learned is a responsible research situation. But in my experience, creative research cannot thrive if it's shoved inside such a tight space, or if it ignores the proclivities of the mind that are required to run the creative journey. So, time to get a little more specific, okay? I suppose first I should define research as I see it functioning in a creative capacity. When I say research, I'm talking about any documented content that exists outside the self. So probably not like what your 8th grade teacher required when, she had you write a research paper. Oh, I have to tell you just this side thing. I don't even know if I have time to do this, but my mom teaches 8th grade research paper writing, and she has a really thick Southern accent. And she kept on telling this student one time that he needed to have, I just ruined the joke. But he turned in his research paper, and it said at the top of the sources page, "We're excited." And she was like, "Why? I'm glad that you're excited about all these sources, Marvin." And she was like, "Why'd you do this?" And he was like, "That's because what you told me to do, Miss Horton." And then it took her a while to realize that with her Southern accent, "we're excited," works cited sounds like "we're excited." So it was a works-cited page. It was the way that it sounded like in her brain. Anyway, I love you, Mom. Okay. So that's what my mama is talking about. But when I say research, I'm talking about any documented content that exists outside the self. So, of course, books and articles and interviews, but also items of art or popular culture, guided travel, archival footage, even web artifacts from social media platforms or from public content sharing services like YouTube, or as Vanessa brought up yesterday, Reddit groups and like affinity groups online. Anything really that might introduce a kind of external accountability to the text while furthering your understanding of the creative investigation is, at least from a creative perspective, research. So here are just a run of a series of sources that have spurred my creative activity. But before we do that, I'm just going to give you a quick kind of mea culpa. I'm usually not the kind of person in craft lectures to spend a ton of time talking about my own work, because usually every topic that I bring up, there are like 16 amazing writers who are engaging in that topic in a way that I want to celebrate in a much deeper capacity. But because we're going to be dealing with this messy, 2 years away from showing it to your editor kind of process thing, the only writer I know that much about is me. So I'm going to be telling you a lot about some essays that I put together. But before I do, as penance, I'm just going to, these are, I don't know, 6 writers who do amazingly innovative things with researched content. And at the end of the lecture, I'm going to put the slide up again, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of them, and maybe ask y'all if you have any other ideas, and we'll add that to the list. So stay tuned. It's not going to be all pigeons and gorillas and all the things that I'm writing about. Okay, so let's see. All right. So my last collection was this really kind of wild, irreverent essay series about animals in human history, animals that we've decided to put in the historical record for some reason or another. And not only did I use the traditional searches through history books, documentary films, timelines, newspaper databases, and science texts, and I also got to know my local research librarians, both in my university and in my small town. And really, if you take nothing from this lecture, just let me tell you, become friends with a librarian. Any question? Not all librarians will do this. You might have to sort of get to, some of them are real busy. But usually, and I've never been in a library where I haven't found at least one person who wants to go through some of these research wormholes that I throw myself down, and who can just perform these magic this great help finding sources from national archives, local archives, these holy grail things that I don't think I'm ever going to be able to get through interlibrary alone. So yeah, that was very, very important resource. Anyway, so when I was working on my book, I even committed the criminal act of consulting Wikipedia almost every day. Not for the facts, no information that appeared in Wikipedia is in my book intentionally, but for just general overviews of subjects in which my research interest had a fleeting interest, and for the potential gold nuggets in the source links at the bottom of every Wikipedia page. Of course, some of those source links will take you to like completely unuseful websites that kind of look like the website for the 1998 version of Space Jam, you know, where it's like black with like white, and like Marvin the Martian is there, and you're like, whoa, run away, and that's not a source for you. But sometimes you get some pretty amazing things. Like I found in the bottom of a Wikipedia search link this, when I was thinking about writing about pigeons, I had a totally different idea, which I'll explain in a bit. I found this photograph of something that's in the National Archives. And that is a message that was rolled into a tube and put in the leg of a pigeon that told the mobile message unit in World War I in France, and I think the Somme, that an American battalion, the 77th Division, was trapped under French fire, right? The French were shelling their allies. And somebody wrote and put on a pigeon this, "We are along the road parallel 276.4, stop. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us, stop. For heaven's sake, stop it, stop." And then I looked up the pigeon, and don't get me started. I'm not gonna go down that pigeon, but y'all, it's amazing. But everything about my essay changed with that one weird Wikipedia jump. I ended up telling the story of this pigeon in war. Her name is Cher Ami. Cher Ami has had a lot of information revealed about the bird has had a lot of information revealed about it in like the past 10 days. So that's another French House conversation. But Cher Ami was flying, got its leg blown off, still made it, came back and saved a bunch of people. Scott Fitzgerald hints that Gatsby was a member of the Lost Battalion and the Great Gatsby. It's just amazing. So now I'm just telling you about my project. That's just an example of like a kind of researched material that completely dictates where I'm going to go next. I wanted to know everything that I possibly could about the ways in which human beings have used pigeons in times of war. And this is maybe, like 5% of the sources that I actually used, but I mean, the variety of the sources is kind of what I wanted to highlight here. I found a military outline of the movement and advancements and retreats of the 77th. It was wrapped. I went down to the basement of the library where they had archived a bunch of books about World War I, and the 77th had its own Dewey Decimal System point, and there were 6 books there, and one of them was wrapped in leather, and it was a bunch of pull-out maps, and I found that. It was amazing. I looked at general nonfiction texts, so like things that kind of give me big, large, they're written for kind of like a general audience, but it gave me kind of big picture about the piece. Those are great to check bibliographies for additional sources as well. I look at a lot of news articles from the period. This one from 1954 is about a Cold War pigeon named Leaping Lena that I really enjoyed reading about. The archived message of the telegram, which I just told you about. I found a YouTube video for the Syrian civil war, toward the beginning of the Syrian civil war, of a bunch of people who were resisting Bashar al-Assad. They were sending carrier pigeons to Homs, because the town of Homs, because communications have been shut off. Homs, homing pigeon, come on. And then I had the YouTube video translated by a friend of mine, Runda, who knows Arabic. And then finally, I used a lot of oral histories, right? People telling me or telling readers about what this material was like. And so I don't know if you can see, this, it's just kind of a scope of what I call kind of hard and soft sources that kind of push through lots of different ways of recounting the way that the world works. Let me give you another example from another essay. I have an essay about Mozart and his pet starling. And I knew that I had to do more than simply report this kind of well-told tale. Mozart people, they all know that Mozart had a pet bird, and oh my goodness, isn't that charming? So I ended up engaging in a practice that I sincerely encourage. I kept another notebook where I wrote to myself as I was researching why such a fact was charming to me while I researched the man, I researched his music, and I also researched the biology of the pet he decided to purchase on a whim one day in 1784. And I realized that they were both musicians, and that my personal fascination involved imagining them on a level playing field as composers. So while I wandered through lots more Mozart resources, the tabs I kept on my fascination told me that I needed to get deeper into the schematics of Mozart's musical genius. basically musical theory, which then made me wonder about the brain of the starling, because Mozart all but described the starling as a genius in a few little scraps of paper that we have from his life. So I engaged in a lot of self-education in this research project. I had to kind of go back to school, researching basic tools for learning musical concepts. That's when I learned that both the classical period of Western music and the biological imperatives of a male starling, they both subscribe to 4-part composition processes. So the classical era of music, the classical form is establishment, development, recapitulation, and coda. And then starlings are whistle, warble, click, and screech. You can hear a starling do this if you sit and listen to a male starling. And I just was like, oh, great. Well, that's what the essay is going to be, right? I now know that the form of my essay is going to be in 4 parts. I know that I'm going to think about sonata form and whistling, warbling, clicking, and screeching as I move forward. And in that parameter, in that cage, to use bird metaphors, I was able to move forward. You can see here a bunch of different sort of things that I had to look at. I took a massive online course, that's a MOOC, recommended by one of my favorite librarians. I learned from a pretty intense animal behavior article about whistle, warble, click, and screech. But then I found that concept illustrated on YouTube. I was like, it works. And then my favorite one, so I spent like months and months and months trying to figure out how to talk about Mozart from a musical theory perspective. And I was pretty sure I had it right. But I was like, I don't know, I mean, maybe. So a friend of mine was telling me that she had, I don't know which way you swipe, but had swiped left or swiped right, whichever one's the good one, on a person who teaches musical theory. And I was like, don't break up with him. So I got her to convince him to come out to coffee with me, and I showed him the pages of my material that were trying to discuss what makes Mozart a genius, and he said I was about 75% there, but I think he really helped me, and then they broke up. So the other thing that I really love to do when I'm kind of using the research to help me figure out what this piece is going to become is finding the little universes inside the topics that I've selected. For my essay about horses, I really wanted to write about Christopher Reeve, who I know that Phil Donahue didn't go over very well in terms of remembering, but Christopher Reeve was one of the Supermans, and he fell off a horse, and it changed his life significantly. He went on to live an amazing life after that, but in a very different body. And I was stymied for a long time with the essay that I wanted to write about Christopher Reeve's horse, whose name was Bucket, because I couldn't figure out or it was Eastern Express, but he called him Bucket. But I couldn't figure out how to not simply recount the details of his famous accident after I learned them from reading his biography, which that felt irresponsible to me. And so the way that I sort of worked through that is I would just loosely throw myself willy-nilly down any wormhole of the field of equestrian sports that I could find, looking for some kind of inspiration to ignite the amazing story that I already knew. I was looking for something that connected me to what kept me thinking about Reeve and his horse in the first place. And so I was really just biding my time, watching episodes of Mr. Ed and reading a manual, for dressage and eventing. Eventing is the sport that Reeve was engaging in when he fell off the horse or when the horse threw him. I think it starts in the Olympics in about a week. And then I just started taking terms from that manual, which I completely didn't understand, and just entering them into YouTube. Just to see what would happen if it came up. And one of the things that I found was this little universe. You know how YouTube has these trends, unboxing videos or folding towels really slowly while talking in a microphone like this? There's a whole industry of helmet cam videos. Does anybody know about these? It's a GoPro on the head of the rider. So that the thing that you see, I'm sorry to tell you about this because it's all you're going to do when you go home, but all you see are the ears of the horse. And then these eventing rides are 20, 30 minutes long. The horse doesn't know the course, but the rider does. And so we watch them sort of run through this cross-country event. And after the event is over, the rider takes the video home and talks into a microphone and sort of narrates it. So you're watching the thing, and then in hindsight, she's sort of telling you about it. And I was just oh, well, there it is. That's it. I mean, there were so many of these. I learned that it was an industry. And the fact that this source was so abundant told me that this could be the essay in the book that tries to put the reader in the driver's seat, which helped me make a decision about point of view. And it also gave me the idea to keep Reeve anonymous, which I thought just seemed kind of right for what the essay is doing. And it allowed me to have this conversation about two animal bodies working together the way that they have in various capacities for something like 7,000 years. And it just opened everything up to me. And you can see with this list that there's still, I have an interview with a person for confirmation after I've tried to teach myself a lot of the material. I have the primary source of the recounting of Reeve's life. I have general nonfiction texts that give me sort of basic ideas. This one taught me so much about the evolution of the horse body, which is super fascinating. It just makes me think of something that Vanessa said yesterday about looking for communities. I think sometimes when you get fascinated by a moment of popular culture or a work of art or something that happened in a specific context, even from an artistic perspective, not even thinking about responsibility, it's really rewarding to participate or let research take you deeper into the communities from which that topic emerged or that event emerged. Okay, so of course there are opportunity costs of a point Sublime style inquiry. Opening your window so wide and just following every Wikipedia, YouTube wormhole you come up with means you get the breeze of perfect facts, but you also get the bugs and anything else that wants to come through your window. My notebooks are graveyards of research junkets that, for a time, I thought might be perfect innovators inside of a piece, and it's also hella time-consuming. Sometimes, like I said, I'll go to the library to check out one book, and I'll end up taking home the entire shelf, knowing that I'll spend a weekend picking through them to find the one-sentence vista that's going to actually matter when the piece is said and done, or even worse, finding one fact that then sends me back to the library to check out another shelf of something entirely different. This time-consuming process is hell on a person's social life, or at least it was pre-pandemic. It's also, I racked up a costly chiropractor bill because of it, but, you know, I guess that's my life. And you have to deal with a lot of creative abandonment and doubt, because you're kind of you're not sure of where you're moving forward, and so you just kind of have to squelch that doubt. For example, my initial idea, my point Sublime for that pigeon essay, the War Pigs pigeon essay I was telling you about, was actually to make it an essay on the pigeon-obsessed father of alternating current, just because I wanted to end it with the line, did you know this? Did you know that Nikola Tesla was in love with a pigeon that died in his arms? I just knew that was where I wanted to go. You know, it was like the Michael Cunningham imagines Virginia Woolf and the Hours just coming up with that line, and then the book goes. It was like that, only with Nikola Tesla and a questionable relationship with a pigeon. But neither Tesla nor electrical science made it anywhere near this piece on war pigeons. So all that work, gone. My Mozart's Starling essay doesn't even mention Glenn Gould, who's over there on the right, who for months I thought was going to be the parallel in Mozart's Starling essay. We're going to talk about peripheral texts in just a second, and I thought the peripheral research text for Mozart's Starling was going to be Gould, because Gould is a fellow genius of composition, he's a magpie, and he's a trickster, and he also happened to have a pet canary named Mozart as a child. And when I was traveling to a visiting writer gig, I even tacked on a pit stop in Toronto at one point to walk one of Glenn Gould's famous perambulatory routes. But there's not a whiff of him in that essay anymore, which is going to be really difficult to explain if I ever get audited, but there you go. There's also the problem with fact-checking in regards to this messy project. By the time the end of the essay rolls around, you have, at least if you're me, I call it a serial killer wall, just full of Post-it notes and links and biographies and like a quote with a question mark, and you kind of have to, in order to not get so bogged down on keeping all the sources in a truly responsible way, I found that it is, in some ways, just barely responsible enough to trace the line back home. And I can tell you a little bit more about that in fact-checking later if you're interested. But let's just say for now that a sprawling and messy research process that spans months or years across multiple media forms makes for some painful accountability practices once the essay is in the can. But it's totally worth it, I think, to keep a creative inquiry at the center of the action. And anyway, more important than a clean and deliberate research line, I'd say, is a clean line to the inspiration and resonance that you experience when taking these wandering walks through the world of research. That's what keeps your research creative, and that's what keeps you searching for the beating heart of the piece. But hey, I understand if you don't want to hand the keys of your whole operation over to research, or if you're not an essayist and this sort of only marginally applies to you, but that doesn't mean that creative considerations of research can't become a smaller part of your practice as well. So let's consider a couple ways that research can help writers, even fictioneers and poets and playwrights, achieve their scenic, formal, and commentary-driven goals for whatever they're writing. So I'm going to divide it back into those four major components of a creative essay, or scene, form, or scene, commentary, form, and research. And I'll just look at scene and then commentary and form pretty briefly, and then we'll be done. Let's take scene, for example. Research can help any prose writer with world creation. This one is pretty obvious, and I know fiction writers are already great at this, but many of us are looking to set our storytelling in time and place. So when I'm setting a scene, I read period magazines. I look at maps, I watch films, I listen to archives of radio shows, unless I'm like writing about cave paintings when there wasn't a radio, and then I watch that cool Werner Herzog documentary. I find novels that were written in that time if they're available to me, and the whole time I do this, I'm looking for details. Sometimes the perfect detail can just nail a scene in a single phrase. I read a biography that was published very shortly after Mozart died, that somebody was sitting in his parlor where there was a piano early one morning, and Mozart burst in, so excited to start composing that he had forgotten that he was still getting his hair done. You know, he had one of those big wigs. And so the hairdresser was following him, holding the tail of his braid, like he was walking a dog, you know? And I just was like, that's it. What an amazing scene. That's perfect. I'm so glad I read 7,000 pages of this book just so I could get that one thing. Great opportunity to look for jargon. Like I learned words like crotchets for quarter notes and Mannheim rocket for the gum bum 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 bum. That's the interval. I just love those words. I love the way they sound. I think they enliven the text in great jargony ways. But honestly, more than that, when I'm doing kind of a world building thing, I'm looking for boundaries. I'm looking for where that world ends. I think that can be one of the most important things about creating a world. One example of this might be, I don't know if you guys ever read Atonement, but toward the end of the book, when Bryony is trying to write a book about what happened, she goes and sees someone at like the British Museum or something, or like a veterans center, and he corrects her. He says, oh, you have here on the page that people were asking for things on the double, but no, we never said that back then. We said at the double, right? So research, like sort of, or seeking that source, sort of put her in. I had a similar experience in the Mozart essay. You know how we say tickle the ivories? The sharp keys on a pianoforte, which was called a forte piano back then, everything was topsy-turvy, but the black keys that are on the top of the piano, they were white. And then the white keys, because ivory was so much more scarce, they were black. So I had to change tickle the ivories to tickle the ebonies. Okay, so now let's move on to commentary. This is my favorite one. It's kind of the hardest to explain, but I really love the way that research and commentary can work together, especially when you're writing personal material. Commentary is basically the bread and butter of nonfiction in many respects. It is, for many essays, the primary vehicle for meaning making, or one of them at least. And I can immediately suggest to all you nonfictioneers, research is a bolster for commentary in two ways. The first one is connecting the personal to the global. This is, of course, not necessary. This is just an option to you. Much of creative nonfiction is concerned with personal stories, but I hear students and pals often wondering about a larger readership's interest or the potential that our inward-facing stories will resonate. And almost always, when you think about it, writing for an audience involves in some aspect moving beyond that internal experience to consider the world. So if you're ever unsure about the external impact of the story you're telling, obviously if you want to tell the story, tell it by all means, but you can still, as a tactic, reach outward and bring in another researched conversation that involves a more collective understanding. Pair your experience with a famous person's life, an animal's life, a biological process, a work of art. Doing this lets the reader know that the world is a part of your thoughts and that they are in your artistic process as well, arguably. A couple of examples of books that do this. Melissa Faliveno came out with a book last year called Tomboyland, which is excellent. It's also a great example of the long essay. You know, they're quite like 12,000 plus words long. The first essay in the piece is about growing up. The book is mostly about Well, among other things, it's about being a Midwesterner. She's from Wisconsin, Mount Horeb, Wisconsin, which she calls Mount Horrible, and her deep-seated lifelong fear of tornadoes. So that's sort of the essay that sets the scene. And I can see that essay, and I think I've read that essay in a lot of different capacities from a lot of different people, right? Going into ourselves and really investigating that fear. But this is this cool thing that she does. The town next to Mount Horeb was flattened when she was like 3 or 4 years old by a tornado. And while she's doing that self-investigation, she also travels to that town, or what's left of that town, and she interviews several people and has their stories kind of come in and talk about. So we've got this external impact and this internal impact, and we watch her sort of empathizing with, thinking with, and trying to tell the stories of these folks. And I think it bolsters the essay in incredibly successful ways. Another example is a memoir by my colleague at Oregon State, Justin St. Germain, called Son of a Gun. It's a novel of his, it's a memoir of his mother. His mother was murdered when he was 20 years old. And he tells that story and he thinks through that story, but he puts a peripheral text up next to it. This murder happened outside of Tombstone, Arizona, which is where the gunfight at the OK Corral took place. It's where he grew up. He had to run a gift shop where people would come in and dress in old-timey clothes. That was his job growing up. And so he starts thinking about the myth of the Old West, the film Tombstone, how that connects to masculinity and toxic masculinity that he feels inside of himself, and because this murder was a product of domestic violence that he sees in his stories. And it really changes the scope of the book in a way that I think is impressive. Not that it wouldn't have been a wonderful story on its own. Okay, second one, thinking a little more toward process. Research can help you turn more difficult to express subject matter, things that are kind of harder to put into words, into effective narrative commentary. Often when we need to discuss in our writing difficult or just really big personal experiences, direct language is not enough. And I can hear every poet in the room being like, yeah, I learned that on the first day of being a poet, Elena. But, nonfiction writers, we think about other things sometimes. Sometimes in nonfiction, when we get to these kinds of impasses, I read in like my undergraduate essays, I cannot put this into words, or it is indescribable the way that I felt in the cornfield. I'm still thinking about cornfields because of Kate's happy birthday. And of course, if it's indescribable, why did you decide to work in an art form that is basically describing things? So you could have interpretive danced about the feeling, But I'm just kidding. Of course, we want to deal with describing things that are very difficult to describe. And of course, we've created figurative language and a bunch of other components to help us address this. But guess what? There's a research version of this that I think can be really cool. And that's this peripheral text thing that I was talking about. You can locate a peripheral topic, a figure, a process, an event, an item in the natural world that is, in its distance from you, easier to write about. Use whatever parallels you understand after your research of that item to do some implicit description of your own experience. So you're describing, discussing, thinking about the other thing, but you've already planted the personal story right next to it. An example, a student that I had was writing about a bad breakup, one that really sort of knocks your socks off for a very, very long time. And she also, for some reason, couldn't stop reading about Charles Darwin and barnacles. And she just speaks kind of very plainly and directly about the breakup. But then when she moves on to talk about Darwin's studies of barnacles in the peripheral text, the barnacles are clinging, the barnacles are growing, the barnacles are developing holes, the barnacles are rejecting, they're accepting, they're overtaking, they're changing the shape until they can't quite see. So we think that we're learning about barnacles, but of course, it's all transferring back over. I think research can really do that in an excellent way. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm just gonna move straight forward. This is the last slide, really. Oh no, there's 2 more slides, but I'm just gonna outline a few ways research can influence form. Form is how the text is rendered on the page in a way that fuels the content of the piece. You've got your traditional kind of paragraphs and indentations, but often when you're doing research, you find non-traditional forms that you can then inject into the essay. Like I said, I didn't know I was writing a 4-part essay until I learned about those 2 Mozart and Starling experiences. A lot of poets might know about Christopher Smart's Geoffrey. Do anybody know "For I Will Consider My Cat Geoffrey"? It's the it's the most famous English language cat poem that was written in the 18th century by a guy who was in Bedlam for religious mania. Some people think he was just drunk. Some people think he was just a deader. But anyway, he wrote this this beautiful poem that I learned was this like intact poem. And then when I decided to write an essay about Geoffrey, I learned that the poem was missing its left half. It was an antiphonal verse. And for the lines the 75 lines that I was reading, there were all these lines that were coming over here. And so there was my form. I had to finish the poem. Another great example of this would be Jenny Booley, who writes essays and footnotes. Ander Monson, in Neck Deep and Other Predicaments, the forms that he discovers fuels his essays in a lot of fabulous ways. My favorite is this one about getting kicked out of Cranbrook in Michigan for stealing people's phone cards, and it's written as a Harvard outline, right? It's fabulous. But I think he sort of found that as some kind of connection to Cranbrook. I'm sort of only half remembering this, but I'm moving kind of quickly so we can move on. A formal research discovery can break up your narrative, providing motion and rhythm, and it signals a kind of shift toward the world at large, especially if the form is something readers recognize outside of a literary tradition. It can also bring a visual representation of whatever research material is a part of your piece's emotional landscape. Examples might be using screenplay text into the personal scene of loving a movie, bringing that artifact into the telling, researching how it works, and then cramming your personal experience into that format can have a profound implicit effect. Okay, and then these last two things, this isn't really form. It's just more style and syntax, but of course, the most tiniest way that you can use research to enliven your prose work is to do it on like a syllable prose level, right? I think, so items of research have syllables. They have beautiful music. They use phonemes. They have sound and syntax. Sometimes when you're putting an argument together, you just need some space in between one idea or another. They can give you the unexpected vocabulary or the syllabic bolstering that you need. Here are two crappy sentences that I wrote that were made better by research. I have an essay on Sinatra in my first book, Frank Sinatra, not Nancy, who's great on Twitter. I had the line, Sinatra was a very spoiled kid. But then I read James Kaplan's biography of Sinatra and learned that he had his own radio. He was the only kid on the block with his own radio. And so not only did I have that great detail, I then could research maybe what the proper name of that radio would be. I learned that there were really two main radios that were sold about the time that he was 10 years old, the Zenith and the Atwater Kent, both of which have several models. And so then I started putting Sinatra interview Atwater Kent, Sinatra interview Zenith into like a million different search sites until I finally found a Dick Cavett in which he admitted that he had an Atwater Kent radio. And what a better way to end with that gorgeous pair of words, Atwater Kent. He was the rare child of the 1920s who had not only his own bedroom, but his very own Atwater Kent. Somebody asked me to write a remembrance because I write a lot about the voice for James Gandolfini when he died. I think he has one of the great American voices. And I learned that he had a dialect coach on The Sopranos, which is like, I thought you were born talking like that because he was from Jersey. And then, so what I did for this was I took the town that Gandolfini was from, and then the town that Sopranos, or the county, was all I could find, takes place in, and then I did a MapQuest search or whatever, and then I found the Garden State Parkway, so then I have these lovely proper nouns to sort of bolster the sentence, right? Okay, so on both micro and macro levels, the sound, shape, and self inside an essay can be enlivened with what a writer collects on their own windy trip to Point Sublime. It's a long, strange, and frustrating trip, and you never know how far along you are until it's over. But for me, it's still the fastest way to maybe not sublimity, but perhaps satisfaction. And I will stop there. Thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate it.